You know that moment when your own son stands up at his wedding reception and decides to roast you in front of 200 guests? Well, that happened to me. I sat there with a frozen smile, my cheeks burning, dying inside as 200 people laughed at my so-called late-life crisis. But what happened next? Let's just say the room went from laughing at me to complete silence in about 30 seconds. Just before you continue to watch, Joe would like you to subscribe to this channel and like this video. It would encourage him to keep his streak of thrilling revenge stories for you to watch. All right, back to the story. Picture this, a beautiful wedding venue, crystal chandeliers, everyone dressed to the nines. My son Robert looked absolutely stunning in his white tuxedo, and I was so proud watching him marry the love of his life, Sarah. The reception was going perfectly. Until he grabbed the microphone. I thought it would be a sweet thank you speech. Instead, he smiled at the crowd and said, "I want to talk about my dad for a minute." Ahs rippled through the room. He's going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis. The room chuckled. I felt my stomach drop. At 60, he decided he wants to build an empire. He actually used finger quotes. The laughter got louder. We keep telling him he should act his age, but he won't listen. I just sat there, smiling, dying. But here's what none of them knew. Not my son, not my new daughter-in-law, and certainly not the 200 guests laughing at the crazy old man trying to play entrepreneur. They didn't know that the most powerful person in that room was sitting quietly at table 6. Because you see, what happened next involved Robert's new wife's boss standing up. He nearly choked on his champagne. He looked at me in shock, and then he said 5 words that changed everything. But to understand how my son's wedding turned into the most satisfying moment of vindication in my entire life, I need to take you back 2 years. Back to when this whole thing started. 2 years earlier, I was Thomas Thompson, 60 years old, recently widowed, and honestly feeling pretty lost. After 30 years working as an operations manager for the same firm, I'd been laid off. The company restructured. We all know what that means. It means they replaced older employees with younger, cheaper ones. For the first time in decades, I was truly on my own. Robert was 32 and living with his fiancée, Sarah. My wife, Mary, had passed away 3 years prior, leaving a gaping hole in my life. And there I was, sitting in my small, quiet apartment, wondering what the heck I was supposed to do with the rest of my life.
But here's the thing about being 60 and suddenly unemployed. You have 2 choices. 1, you can accept that your best years are behind you. You can take up gardening, watch daytime TV, and quietly fade away. 2, you can decide that all those years of experience, all that knowledge, all that grit, might actually be worth something. I chose option 2. I took a small part of my severance and started a consulting business. I helped small companies with their operations and efficiency. Nothing glamorous, I was just using the skills I'd developed over 3 decades of keeping offices from falling apart. I called it TT Enterprises. Simple, professional, and it kept my personal name out of it. The problem was, nobody in my family took it seriously. Robert, my own son, would roll his eyes whenever I mentioned a new client. "Dad, you're 60, not 23, he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "Maybe it's time to act your age." Act my age? What did that even mean? Was there an expiration date on ambition I didn't know about? Sarah was even worse. She was a mid-level manager at a tech company, and she was constantly trying to mansplain basic business concepts to me, like I was a child playing dress-up. "Have you considered, Thomas," she'd say, leaning forward with a smug look, "that your cash flow projections might be optimistic? It's a common mistake for beginners." Beginner? I'd been balancing multi-million-dollar departmental budgets when she was still learning to ride a bike. Family dinners were the worst. Have you considered finding a normal job instead of this entrepreneur phase? My sister would ask, her voice dripping with concern. Thomas, you missed your chance. Just accept it and find something stable. Even my friends meant well, but their comments stung. It's so cute that you're trying, Thomas, one said over coffee. But realistically, how much can you really accomplish starting over at your age? The worst part was that I was actually good at what I was doing. Really good. My little business wasn't so little. My clients were thriving. My contracts were growing. That first year, I made more money than I ever had as an operations manager. The second year, I doubled it. I wasn't just consulting. I was acquiring. I'd find struggling companies with good bones, use my expertise to fix their operations, and roll them into TT Enterprises. But every time I tried to share a success, my family would pat me on the head, like I was a toddler who'd managed to tie his own shoes. "Oh, that's nice, Dad," Robert would say when I mentioned landing a major new contract. Anyway, we were thinking of going with the peonies for the centerpieces.
He was planning his wedding during this time, and he made it very clear that he didn't want me talking about my little business to Sarah's colleagues. "Dad, please," he'd begged me a month before the wedding, "please don't embarrass me by telling people you're an entrepreneur." "Embarrass you? Just say you're between jobs or something," he pleaded. "Or retired. Just say you're retired." I agreed. I agreed because I loved my son, and I wanted his wedding day to be perfect. But sitting there, listening to his friends make jokes about my midlife crisis, while I was quietly paying for half the wedding expenses they didn't even know about, I started to realize something. My family wasn't just unsupportive. They were actively ashamed of me. Ashamed of me for refusing to fade quietly into middle-aged invisibility. And that hurt more than any layoff ever could. The wedding day arrived. It was absolutely beautiful. Robert had chosen this gorgeous venue with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden. I'd helped pay for quite a bit of it. Robert and Sarah just assumed the money came from my wife's life insurance rather than my thriving business. It was easier to let them believe that. I dressed carefully that morning. A nice, but not too flashy, dark gray suit. Elegant, but not attention-grabbing. The last thing I wanted was to upstage the groom. Robert had specifically asked me again not to mention my consulting work. "Just blend in, Dad," he'd said during the rehearsal dinner, giving me a tight, warning smile. "Sarah's boss, Mr. Henderson, will be there with his wife, plus a bunch of people from her tech company. These are serious business people, so please don't go on about your little projects." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Little projects, right? I just nodded. The ceremony was perfect. Robert looked like a prince. Sarah seemed genuinely happy, and I cried, actual happy tears, watching my son start this new chapter. During the cocktail hour, I mingled quietly. I made small talk with aunts and uncles. I stayed well away from Sarah's work crowd, just as I'd been asked. But I couldn't help overhearing some of their conversations. These serious business people from the tech company were discussing market strategies, recent acquisitions, and operational efficiency in their industry. I knew more about their sector than they probably realized. My little project had just acquired 2 mid-sized tech firms in the last quarter. But I kept my mouth shut. I smiled politely. When I was introduced, I just said, "I'm Robert's father, Thomas. So lovely to meet you." Then came dinner. And then came the speeches. Everything was going smoothly until Robert's best man, Mark, decided to give his speech.
He started sweet. He talked about their friendship, how beautiful the wedding was, but then he shifted gears. "Now, I have to talk about the groom's family," he said with a grin, "especially Robert's dad, who's been quite the character lately." The room chuckled. My stomach dropped. "Thomas is going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis," Mark continued. The laughter got louder. I could feel Sarah's colleagues at the next table turning to look at me. "At 60, Mark said, raising his champagne glass, he decided he wants to build an empire." He actually used finger quotes. I wanted to disappear under the table. "We keep telling him he should act his age, but he won't listen," Mark giggled. "He's trying to compete with people half his age in business." More laughter. "But hey, at least he's keeping busy instead of just golfing like normal dads his age, right? We love our delusional dad anyway." The whole room was laughing now. 200 people, all enjoying a good, hearty laugh at my expense. At my expense! I sat there with that frozen smile, my face a mask, my cheeks burning with humiliation. But the worst part wasn't Mark's speech. The worst part was watching Robert's face during it. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't trying to stop it. He was laughing along, nodding like this was all perfectly acceptable, like it was funny. When Mark sat down, Robert stood up to give his own speech. I thought, okay, maybe he'll balance things out. Maybe he'll say something nice about me. Instead, he doubled down. "Thanks for that, Mark. Yes, my dad has definitely been on an adventure lately," Robert said into the microphone, his voice bright. "He keeps insisting he's building a business empire." He used the finger quotes too. My own son. "We're just trying to get him to accept that some dreams have expiration dates," he said, looking around the room for approval. "When you're over 60, maybe it's time to be realistic about what you can actually accomplish." The room erupted in laughter again. Sarah's colleagues were practically in tears. I saw Sarah's boss, Mr. Henderson, shaking his head with an amused smile. Even the servers seemed to be trying not to laugh as they collected dinner plates. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, I wanted to disappear. But most of all, I wanted my son to stop publicly humiliating me on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of both our lives. "But we support Dad's hobby anyway," Robert continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Even if it means listening to him talk about client meetings and business strategies like he's some kind of CEO." The way he said CEO, like it was the most ridiculous concept in the world. That's what finally broke something inside me. This wasn't just unsupportive. This wasn't just dismissive. This was cruel. And it was happening in front of everyone. Everyone who mattered to him. Everyone who mattered to his new wife's career. People who could have been valuable connections for my actual business if they'd only known the truth. As Robert finished his speech to thunderous applause, I felt completely and utterly defeated. I decided I'd had enough humiliation for one evening. I would quietly slip out after dinner. I'd make an excuse about not feeling well. The last thing I wanted was to cause any more drama, even though my heart was in pieces. After Robert's speech, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. People started approaching my table. Not with congratulations, but with the kind of patronizing sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Good for you," one of Sarah's aunts said,
patting my shoulder like I was a brave little boy who had attempted to ride a bicycle. "Good for you for trying something new at your age." "It's never too late to chase dreams, even small ones," added another guest, giving me a condescending smile. "My neighbor started selling wood carvings at 60, made almost $300 last year." Sarah's colleagues were even worse. When someone introduced me as the groom's enterprising father, they'd nod politely and immediately change the subject. I could practically see them thinking, "Oh, another middle-aged man with a cute little side hustle." One of them actually said, "That's wonderful. My father-in-law started making model airplanes. It keeps him busy." Keeps me busy. Like I was some kind of charity case who needed hobbies to fill my empty days. But the absolute worst moment came when Sarah herself pulled me aside. "Thomas," she gave me a one-armed hug, "thanks for being such a good sport about the speeches." I just nodded, my jaw tight. "It was just him having fun," she said, obviously unaware. "But I didn't want you to feel bad about, your consulting thing." My consulting thing?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yeah," she said, obviously unaware. "I mean, it's great that you're staying active and trying new things, but I hope you're not putting too much pressure on yourself to make it into something big. At your age, it's really more about staying engaged than actually building a career, right?" I stared at her. This was my daughter-in-law. This was the woman my son had chosen to spend his life with, and she was telling me to know my place. "Sarah," I said carefully, "what exactly do you think I do?" She shrugged. "Some kind of small business consulting? Robert mentioned you help local shops with their paperwork or something, which is nice. Every little bit helps when you're starting over later in life." Local shops. Paperwork. I nodded slowly. "Excuse me," I whispered, and I walked to the restroom. I sat in a stall and tried not to cry. My own family, my own son. They thought I was some kind of amateur, some kind of failure, playing at business. They had no idea. They had no idea that in the past 18 months, I had acquired 6 companies. 6! Including a major tech firm that was probably worth more than everything Sarah would earn in her entire career. When I came back out, my face repaired, I heard Robert talking to one of his groomsmen near the bar. "Poor Dad," Robert was saying, and my heart just cracked. He's been so lost since Mom passed. This whole business thing is just his way of feeling important again. We don't have the heart to tell him it's never going to be anything real. "That's so sad," his friend replied. "But at least he's keeping busy, instead of becoming one of those depressing empty nest dads who calls their kids every day." "Exactly," Robert said, and they both laughed again. And something inside me just broke. This wasn't just about being underestimated anymore. My own son genuinely believed I was a pathetic, middle-aged man desperately grasping for relevance. My success was make-believe. My ambitions were delusional. The irony was devastating. I made it through the rest of dinner. I smiled. I nodded. I listened as more people offered their insulting advice about realistic expectations for men my age. I was planning to slip out quietly after the cake cutting, fake a headache, leave the newlyweds to enjoy their party. But then something happened. Something I definitely wasn't expecting. During the after-dinner socializing, Mr. Henderson approached me. I'd been trying to avoid Sarah's boss all evening. I didn't want to endure another conversation about my cute little consulting hobby. "Mr. Thompson," he said politely, holding a glass of champagne. "I don't think we've been properly introduced.
I'm Mr. Henderson, Sarah's supervisor at Sterling Tech.
Sterling Tech. My heart nearly stopped. It's Mr. Thompson, I managed to say, my voice steady. And yes, Mr. Henderson, I know who you are. He smiled, a polite, professional smile. Sarah mentioned you're in business consulting. That's wonderful. What kind of work do you do? I took a deep breath. I looked at Mr. Henderson, this polite man who had laughed at the jokes, this man who had no idea what was about to happen. And I realized this conversation was going to be very interesting indeed. Well, Mr. Henderson, I said carefully, I work in acquisitions and operational consulting. I help companies optimize their efficiency and growth potential. He nodded, politely, still smiling. That sounds fascinating. Mostly with small, local businesses, I imagine? There it was again. Small. Local. Actually, I said, my voice as smooth as glass, I focus on mid-size companies in the tech sector. Firms that are ready to scale but need strategic guidance and capital investment. His eyebrows raised, just slightly. Really? That's quite specialized. How long have you been in that field? About 2 years seriously, I said, though I've been building toward it for years. Impressive, he said. But I could tell he still thought I was talking about much smaller deals than I actually handled. Have you worked with any companies I might know? I paused. This was the moment. I could either continue deflecting, just like my son asked, I could smile and be the cute old man, or I could be honest. After the speeches, the finger quotes, the late life crisis jokes, after my own son called me pathetic, I was tired of hiding. Actually, yes, I said, meeting his gaze. I recently completed an acquisition of Sterling Technologies. The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. His polite smile froze. It didn't just fade, it shattered. His eyes widened. Sterling Technologies, he repeated. Yes, I said. The acquisition closed about 3 months ago. He stared at me, just stared. I could practically see the wheels turning, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. Wait a minute, he said, his voice suddenly much quieter. Sterling Technologies was acquired by TT Enterprises. I just looked at him. You're not saying... He licked his lips. I'm T. Thompson. He choked. He literally choked on his champagne and started to cough. You're T. Thompson? He stammered, grabbing a napkin. The T. Thompson? The T. Thompson who acquired Sterling? That would be me. He choked. He literally choked. He stammered. He stammered. He stammered. He took T. Thompson. He stammered. Mr. Thompson, I am so sorry. If I had known... It's fine, Mr. Henderson, I said quietly. I deliberately keep a low profile. But it's not fine, he said, his voice rising slightly. He was clearly panicking, running a hand through his hair. Sir, I need to apologize for this entire evening, the way people have been, the speeches, the way they've been talking to you, treating you like... He looked around the room, where people were still laughing and drinking, oblivious. This is mortifying. Mr. Henderson, please, I said. Don't worry about it. I chose not to correct anyone. But you shouldn't have to, he insisted. Do you realize that half the people in this room, from Sarah's work, they work for companies in your portfolio, My head snapped up. What? Yes, he said, starting to point discreetly. The Millers over there. They work for Quantum Solutions. You acquired that in January. The Davies couple by the bar? Dataflow Systems. That was your March acquisition. My God, half of these people's paychecks, they ultimately come from companies you control. And they're making jokes about your midlife crisis. I felt a strange, cold wave wash over me. A mix of total vindication and profound sadness. Here was the proof. The proof that I had built something significant, something that mattered. But it also highlighted just how completely, how painfully my own family had misjudged and underestimated me. What's really disturbing, Henderson continued, his voice low and angry, is that your son's speech, he essentially mocked you for having unrealistic business ambitions. But you haven't been unrealistic at all. You've been incredibly successful. He just doesn't know it. Sarah was definitely watching us now. She glanced over with a curious, slightly nervous expression, probably wondering why her boss was talking so seriously with his hobby entrepreneur father-in-law. She started walking over. "Everything okay here?" Sarah asked, putting on that breezy, confident smile. "You two seem to be having quite an intense conversation." Henderson looked at me. His eyes were wide, clearly asking for permission. I gave him a single, small nod. I was done hiding. "Sarah," Henderson said, his voice careful and tight, "I was just learning more about your father-in-law's consulting business." Sarah let out a dismissive chuckle. "Oh, that." She actually patted my shoulder, condescendingly. "Yeah, Thomas has been trying his hand at the business world. It's actually pretty cute how seriously he takes it." The look of absolute horror that crossed Mr. Henderson's face was almost comical. "Cute?" Henderson repeated, his voice flat. "Well, you know how it is. When people start over later in life, you have to encourage them, even if their goals are a bit optimistic." She looked at me. "But we support Thomas's little venture, don't we, Dad?" Henderson stared at Sarah. He stared at her like she had watched someone insult the president to their face without having any idea who they were talking to. "Sarah," Henderson said, slowly, his voice dangerously low, "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her smile finally fading. Henderson looked at me one more time. I gave him another small nod. The cat was about to be let out of the bag. "Thomas Thompson is T. Thompson of TT Enterprises." Sarah's face was blank. "He owns Sterling Technologies. He owns the company we work for." Sarah's face went completely slack. "What?" "He's not a small-time consultant helping local shops," Henderson said, his voice gaining volume. "He has acquired 6 major companies in the past 18 months, including ours." Henderson leaned in. "Sarah, your father-in-law is your boss's boss's boss." The moment when Sarah's brain finally processed what Henderson was saying, it was like watching someone get hit by a truck in slow motion. Her mouth opened and closed and opened again. No sound came out. Sarah finally managed. That's impossible." She looked at me, her eyes frantic. He drives an old Honda. He lives in that small apartment." "He deliberately maintains a modest lifestyle," Henderson finished, his voice sharp. "A lot of serious investors do that. It keeps them focused on the business rather than lifestyle inflation." Other people were starting to notice. The conversation had drawn attention. I could see curious faces turning our way.
Henderson seemed to realize that the secret was well and truly out now. And honestly, after the evening I'd had, I wasn't entirely upset about it. "You know what?" Henderson said, his voice getting louder, his face hardening with indignation. "I think people should know this." And before I could stop him, he was walking toward the microphone. "Excuse me, everyone," Henderson said into the mic. His voice boomed across the entire reception hall. "I'm sorry to interrupt the festivities, but I need to share something remarkable that I just discovered." The music stopped. All conversation ceased. 200 people turned to look at him with curious expressions. I wanted to disappear under the table, but it was too late. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson continued, "I just had the most enlightening conversation with the father of the groom." I saw Robert staring at Henderson, his face a mask of confusion, probably wondering why his new wife's boss was talking about me at his wedding. "You see, we've all been treating Mr. Thompson as if he were some kind of amateur, dabbling in business as a hobby." His eyes scanned the crowd. "We've been patronizing him, dismissing his accomplishments, and frankly, we've been incredibly rude." The room was dead silent now. I could feel every single eye in the place turning toward me. "What we didn't realize," Henderson's voice grew stronger, "is that Thomas Thompson is actually T. Thompson, the founder and CEO of TT Enterprises." Gasps. I heard them. Little, sharp gasps echoing around the room. Someone dropped a fork. It clattered loudly on a plate. I heard Robert make a small choking sound next to me. "He's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry."
"In the past 18 months alone," he said, his voice ringing with amazement, "Mr. Thompson has acquired 6 major companies, including Sterling Technologies, where I work as Chief Operating Officer." The silence was deafening. "He's built a $50 million business portfolio," Henderson said, "while we've all been treating him like he was playing dress-up." Then all hell broke loose. "What?" Robert shrieked it, so loud that everyone in the room heard him. People started talking all at once. I saw the Millers from Quantum Solutions frantically whispering to each other. They'd been among the most condescending. The Davies couple from Dataflow looked like they'd seen a ghost. Sarah was still standing there, her mouth hanging open like a fish. "Furthermore," Henderson continued, clearly on a roll now, "I need to point out that roughly half the people from my company in this room actually work for companies that Mr. Thompson now owns." That's when the real panic set in. I watched executives and employees frantically trying to remember every single dismissive comment they'd made to me throughout the evening. The man who'd compared me to his model airplane-making father-in-law looked like he was about to be physically sick. Robert was staring at me, just staring. His expression was one I'd never seen before. Complete, utter shock, mixed with something that looked a lot like horror. Dad, is this true?" Before I could answer, Henderson spoke again. "I think Mr. Thompson should be the one to respond to that question." He turned, and he handed me the microphone. 200 people fell silent again. All of them, waiting for my response. This was definitely not how I'd planned to spend my son's wedding reception. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but I held the microphone steady. "Well, yes, it's true. I am T. Thompson of TT Enterprises." The room erupted again, but I held up a hand. "I know this comes to a surprise to many of you, especially my family. I've deliberately kept a low profile. I prefer to let my work speak for itself,
rather than seeking publicity or recognition. I looked directly at Robert. He was pale, ghostly pale. "Son," I said, "I didn't tell you because you specifically asked me not to talk about my business tonight. You were embarrassed by what you thought was my little consulting hobby. So I respected your wishes, and I stayed quiet." "But, Dad, you said you were doing small business consulting." "I never said small. I said business consulting. You assumed it was small because you thought I was too old and too inexperienced to accomplish anything significant."
The room was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. "When you gave your speech earlier," I continued, my voice gentle but clear, "about my late life crisis and how I should act my age, you were talking about a business that employs over 400 people across 6 companies. I looked right at him. "When you said I was being unrealistic about what I could accomplish, you were referring to accomplishments that have already happened." Sarah finally found her voice. "Thomas, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for everything I said. I feel like such an idiot." "Sarah," I said, looking at my new daughter-in-law, "you assumed that a man my age couldn't possibly know more about business than you do? That's worth thinking about." But the person I was really watching was Robert. My son looked absolutely devastated, and not in a good way. He wasn't proud, he wasn't excited about my success. He looked mortified that he'd been so wrong, so publicly. "Dad," he said quietly, tears welling in his eyes, Why didn't you tell me?" "Because every time I tried to share good news about my business," I said, the pain of the last 2 years rising in my throat, "you'd roll your eyes and change the subject. You told me I was having a midlife crisis. You said that some dreams have expiration dates." I gestured around the room. "You asked me not to embarrass me by talking about my work to your wife's colleagues, many of whom, as it turns out, now work for me." The implications of that were starting to sink in. I could see people physically recoiling, frantically trying to remember if they'd said anything offensive. Henderson stepped forward again. "If I may add something," he said, "Mr. Thompson has been incredibly gracious about tonight's misunderstandings. A lesser person might have been deeply offended by some of the comments that were made." Robert's best man, Mark, who had started the whole thing, he looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "But what I find most impressive," Henderson continued, "is that Mr. Thompson was willing to endure public mockery rather than upstage his son's wedding with news of his business success. That shows remarkable character and remarkable love for his family." Now, Robert really looked like he was going to cry, but not from happiness. "So," I said into the microphone, taking back control, "I hope you'll all forgive the dramatic revelation. This wasn't how I planned to spend the evening, but sometimes the truth has a way of coming out." I looked at Robert, with all the love I could muster, despite the hurt. "And now, let's get back to celebrating this beautiful couple and their future together." I handed the microphone back to Henderson and sat down.
The room gradually returned to normal conversation levels. But everything had changed. People who had been patronizing me all evening were now approaching my table with very different attitudes. "Mr. Thompson," said the man who had compared me to his model airplane-making father-in-law. He was sweating. "I owe you a huge apology. I had no idea. I mean, if I had known..." "It's fine," I told him. "Really." But it wasn't fine. Not really. Not for Robert. As the evening wound down, I could see him struggling. struggling with the reality of how wrong he'd been, about his own father. When he finally approached me, as the last guests were leaving, his eyes were red and puffy. "Dad," he whispered, I don't know what to say. I feel terrible about everything. The speech, the way I've been treating your work, all of it." "Robert, son," I said, "it's your wedding day. Let's not let this spoil it." "But I was awful to you," he cried, the tears spilling over, "in front of everyone. And you just sat there and took it, because you didn't want to ruin my day." He was sobbing now. "What kind of son does that? What kind of son am I?" I looked at my son, my beautiful, successful, and suddenly very small-looking son. "Robert," I said, my voice steady but firm, "you stood up in front of 200 people and you mocked me. You mocked me for refusing to act my age. You told everyone my dreams had expiration dates. That's not just a mistake, son. That's cruel." He flinched. "You weren't just wrong about the facts. You were willing to humiliate me publicly rather than support me. We have a lot to work through before things can go back to normal." As Robert and Sarah left for their honeymoon the next morning, I could tell this revelation was going to change our family dynamics significantly. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. 6 months after the wedding, things had changed in ways I never expected. Sarah started calling me Mr. Thompson, even at family dinners. And she actually started asking for my business advice. Turned out, she was much more respectful when she realized her job security depended on staying in my good graces. Funny how that works. My sister? She stopped giving me lectures about realistic expectations. She started bragging to her friends about my brother, the entrepreneur. Amazing how quickly people's tune changes when success becomes undeniable. And Robert, well, that took longer to repair. He came back from his honeymoon expecting things to go back to normal, but I held firm to my boundaries. We started family therapy. Yes, at 62 years old, I dragged my 34-year-old son to counseling. Turns out, being a powerful businessman means you don't have to accept being treated poorly by anyone, including your own family. The best part? 3 of the guests from that wedding, the ones who worked for the tech companies, they approached me afterward about consulting contracts for other firms they knew. Apparently, being publicly revealed as a business powerhouse is excellent marketing. Who knew? And Mr. Henderson? He became one of my most trusted executives. Sometimes the best business relationships start with a little bit of champagne and a whole lot of shock. These days, when people ask about my late life career change, I just smile. Because at 62, I've learned the most important business lesson of all. Never underestimate a man who's decided he's done being underestimated. So that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Was Robert's public embarrassment at his own wedding justified payback? Or should I have handled the revelation differently? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, comment, and smash the subscribe button. Also, check out other videos on the channel. Joe's got more interesting stories for you.